Welcome to the Establish the Edge podcast. I'm your host, Mike Leone, here with Ben Gretch of bengretch.substack.com, back for episode 6 of our offseason projection special with the NFC West. We took a week off. The people have been clamoring for this division in particular. So, yeah, Ben, I'm looking forward to it.
Yeah, we were hearing that it's been too long. People are getting itchy for these final three divisions. We'll knock them out.
Once they're done, people, they're done, though. So let's start with San Francisco. To me, it's the most interesting team in the division for some macro reasons, some micro reasons. Let's start with the macro, which is the play calling, and can kind of see the differences off the bat a little bit. We're at 62.2 plays per game. Ben's at 60.6. Both of those are below average, but ours is pretty close to league average. Ben, I'm assuming your 60.6 is one of the lower ones you have, or bottom 10, I would assume.
Yeah, I can look that up real quick. It's got to be on the lower.
And while you look that up, in terms of pass rate, we're at 58.5%. Ben's at 56.5%. You'll notice the correlation quite often when we're different. The person with the higher pass rate is higher on the plays total, which obviously makes sense. You're going to wind the clock much less frequently when you're throwing the football. The reason they're difficult to project is they had a pretty big, for them, spike in pass rate last season compared to what they normally do. I believe they finished at like 60%, but in previous seasons, they've been more like mid 50s, like a very low called pass rate. So there's kind of two school of thoughts there. One being, okay, CMC is going to be back. They had lots of issues last year. They're projected to be much better in terms of win total. This pass rate is going to come down quite a bit. The other kind of flip side is in terms of PROE, their pass rate over expectation was only negative 2% last year. That year they were kind of mid 50s. In 2023 in pass rate, I believe it was more like a negative 6% PROE. I'll double check that, but it was around there. So it wasn't just game script related. Now, of course, CMC plays a big factor in terms of how much you're going to run the ball too. So it's an interesting kind of angle to figure out, and it's tough and important to figure out because this is a team that is very efficient, will score the ball quite a bit, projected to score the ball quite a bit, somewhat concentrated, but like not a ton of like catch volume on the team. So like the pass rate and the play calling does end up mattering a decent bit.
Yeah. And so I do have them close to my lowest number. There's a couple interesting things here. We've beat around the bush on one little stat that last year, the league average plays per game was 62.2. You and I have always used the low 63s as league average, but so the 3 years prior, working back, 63.1, 63.0, 63.3. For the entire league average of plays per game to drop basically a full play to 62.2 last year is pretty meaningful. I think I mentioned it on one of the earlier shows, but I think that's because of the touchback rule changing and the drive starting at the 30, and also just the general increase in rushing rate, which has been, so we're getting more running clocks and we're getting fewer plays per drive, and you get into situations where you wind up with a field goal drive on fewer plays, and it does kind of just overall affect the total number of plays in the game, I think. And so I'm projecting about 62.6 as my league average this year, which is probably a full half play per game lower than you guys. So that's one note. And then I've got the Niners at 60.6, so about 2 plays per game below average. You guys at 62.2, I do like that number. I think I'm too low. That would be their highest number in 5 years. I have 60.4, 60.4, 61.8, and 60.6 the last 4. And so they haven't been at 62 in 4 straight years. So it's what I had in my notes after 2023 was that it was about regressing their elite 2023 efficiency, but knowing that was going to mean more play volume, because when you're not, we've talked about this with the other elite efficiency offenses, when you're not scoring quickly, you run more plays on your drives and those things. They did have to run a lot more plays, and their pass rate did go way up, as you mentioned, and they still didn't see a lot more play volume last year. They're still at 60.4 despite their efficiency. And really that's because of missed time. If you go look at, CMC misses the whole year and Aiyuk misses the whole year, and Debo probably plays through pneumonia to some degree. And, Pearsall misses the first half of his rookie year, and like all their players, and then Jordan Mason's hitting and then he misses time. They had so much missed time in this offense last year. And so that hurts their efficiency. I just thought it was weird that didn't lead to more play volume.
Yeah.
I mean, they've low play volume regardless if they're really efficient or if they're not. And I think that's odd.
Yeah. As you're talking about it, I think we'll probably come down on plays a little bit. I'm just remembering from DFS, them sometimes being a team our algorithm would have a tough time with. I think we improved our play calling there a lot better last year, but in previous years when we didn't have as good of a model, generally the offenses that score like they do run more plays. So the model picks up on that. But teams like, I think San Francisco and Miami, and they both kind of have some similarity with the pre-snap motion stuff, do end up not running nearly as many plays as you kind of would expect.
But they do get really concentrated, as you were saying. And so it can still be okay for fantasy, even with the lower play volume.
Yes, because, part of the low play volume, even when they were bad you mentioned them being bad last year, but even when they're a good, part of the reason is just efficiency. And even last year, like Purdy's yards per attempt was very strong. They're generally moving the ball in chunks. I'm just checking our pace stuff to add some things in that. But we did a kind of a combined pace for the last 2 years, and the Shanahan offenses are both the past 2 seasons are very low in terms of pace over expected in basically any situation, no huddle, basically any metric that feeds into pace. So I think we probably will come down on plays a little bit.
But I'm going to come up because you're right. I was close. I don't check it, but I do think San Francisco is going to bounce back, be a good offense. And I have them, I think, just a 0.1 higher than my lowest projected team. And you just can't have a team with a double-digit win total projected as one of your very low. I mean,
that's the rub with San Francisco for sure, and why it's difficult. The teams. So this situation that we kind of ranked the teams last 2 years, like out of 64 teams. So San Francisco's in there twice, once for 2023, once for 2024. But if I just look at the teams in terms of motion and then pace, like most of the teams that you're using a lot of motion are pretty slow paced. You literally have both I mentioned Miami. So like the data's kind of backing up my matching there. Miami's in there. Kind of the one exception is just Atlanta from last year as a team that used a lot of motion and still had a bit better pace. But that was, they were kind of just made the top 10 there in terms of the motion rank.
And that's another thing that's impacting play volume, because motion's been on the upswing overall. As you're talking through that, that's really interesting as far as the league level trend as well. More teams are using more motion to, with the ways that teams are defending them now, to get into better spots. And then that's going to lead to fewer play. I mean, there's a lot of McShaney offenses out there. The McVay's offense probably uses a ton of motion and is also slow in pace, I imagine, with the Rams.
So let's move along to Purdy, who I like from a fantasy perspective a decent bit. In best ball, in particular, we kind of have hit on the theme in the redraft a lot about how, like, I do like a guy like Purdy relative to cost, but sometimes there's just so many of the QBs 13 through 16 that we like that you might just be better off waiting in a redraft setting. I say that with his FFPC ADP is like 138. So I think even at that cost, he's probably a decent investment. He scrambled more. What I liked with Purdy last year, we saw him run more. We also saw the way he achieved a high yards per attempt, which was strong for, a second straight season. But he did it in a much different way than the year prior. The year prior, when people were kind of like shaming him for being in an MVP conversation, it was like, it's all the skill players, it's all yards after the catch, it's all scheme stuff. Last year, a lot of his players got hurt. He was making a lot of plays out of structure. It was higher ADOT stuff down the field, much higher conversion of air yards as opposed to just yards after the catch. And he still comes in at 8.5 yards per attempt, which is really strong. The TD rate, of course, fell. The team goes 6-9 and just doesn't score quite as much. So I was pretty encouraged with Purdy's season last year.
I think you described that perfectly. I don't have much to add. I think in some ways his year last year was better than the year prior because of all of what you just said. There was so much less there to support him, and he had to do so much more as a vertical passer and was challenged. Some stats to back up your point. Rush attempts per game, 4.4 last year after 2.4 and 2.8 in the first 2 years. On 66 rushes last year, he had about double the rushing yards that he had across his first year and a half combined, which was 61 rushes, relatively close to the same number of rushes, but he had about double the rushing yards. He had 3 rushing TDs in that first year and a half, 5 last year alone. I am projecting him to keep some of those gains. I do think if he has, a lot of talent around him, he'll be able to distribute better, probably doesn't have to scramble as much. Like probably that was somewhat of a response to a lack of separation earning in his pass catcher group and that type of stuff.
Line issues as well.
Yeah, some line issues. But I also think maybe it was a little bit of evidence the training wheels taken off a little bit, right? Allowing him to develop his skill set and his playmaking a little more than what we saw in the first 2 years, where it was somewhat system-based and distribute. And as he continues to progress, I like some of that scrambling to stick. Probably not all of it, because that was a pretty big jump from the first couple of years.
Yeah, and to put numbers on it, we got very similar Purdy projections. We're both in over 4,200 yards passing, upper 20s in passing touchdowns. We're right around 60 rush attempts, about 250 rushing yards, 3.5 rushing touchdowns. We had very similar numbers on Purdy, both over 8 yards per attempt as well. Going to CMC, Gretch is at 252 carries and 80 targets. We're at 218 and 69. We are very conservative on our CMC inputs. I would say both on base and even like we give each player an odds of hitting his ceiling, and we've kind of docked his a little bit just on like injury risk stuff that we don't normally do. And I'm not sure if that's right or not. It's just the first rounds, like we feel so good about kind of like the top 5 or 6 players. We've been afraid to fully put that on him. My point being that the discrepancy between our numbers and Gretch is like, if CMC plays a full season, he's probably, hitting Gretch's numbers. And we still have him top. I think we have him about 7th overall in most formats. But this is a player that, once again, if he stays healthy, he could easily be return to being the top player in all of fantasy. Like I said, our inputs are extremely conservative, and we have him inside the top 10.
And we've always talked about this, but I come in a little hot because I like to look at it like I don't have as much research into like the missed time and the things that you guys have built into your projections that make them way more accurate, and your numbers are going to reflect a better range of outcomes. For me, it becomes a thing of like, I would just be guessing at how much missed time he is, and I want it to be consistent. So I like to just pretty much assume health, basically, is the point that I'm getting at. And so when I pretty much assume health, he comes out as my RB1. Like he comes out as when he's healthy, it changes this whole offense. It changes this whole projection. The running back target rate spikes when he's healthy. It wasn't as high last year. It also suddenly becomes very difficult to dole out targets to all the positions because the running back target rate spikes. So if he's out there, I think it meaningfully impacts the receivers and the tight end, right? I mean, it changes the whole thing. But yeah, he looks healthy this offseason. They're talking about him very favorably, and they're saying that they expect him to be, he's done everything he can to take care of himself and all of those things. So I mean, I guess I'm not taking a lot of him, but he's like such an enigma. I don't even know what to say about him. That's what you just said. Like, if he's healthy, he's probably going to beat value and probably going to be pretty darn good.
Yeah. And it's just tough because if I felt worse about the top 5 or 6 names on the board, I might be, normally I'm the guy that's like, it's tough to predict health. We know what this person can do. Let's be in on that upside. But you're talking guys like CD, Jefferson, Chase, Bijan, Barkley, even Jahmyr Gibbs in there. Like it's a pretty good group. That said, I think we'll probably unwind like kind of like our ceiling odds doc that we have on him as we continue to get closer to the season and the reports continue to be good on CMC.
I got a question for you on him, because the one I think about with him is Barkley, because I think the really hard to quantify thing is he had, what was it, like 482 touches through the postseason.
Yeah.
And I don't know how to quantify if that increases his injury risk the next year. Obviously, there's been a lot of research done on that. I do know that if I project them both to be healthy, that the way that McCaffrey is using the passing game probably gives McCaffrey a better statistical ceiling in like a PPR format. And so how much more injury prone do I think McCaffrey is? And do I just think that because he got injured last year and Barkley didn't? Like, is it like a little bit of recency bias in that regard? They're both older backs. I keep putting them in the same spot in my head in terms of injury risk, and acknowledging that CMC's statistical profile is probably a higher ceiling the way that the receiving plays.
Yeah, I'd say a couple things there. One, JJ Zachariason in his newsletter had a good explanation on the Barkley thing, which a lot of it is these players with high touches do generally see less touches and sometimes get hurt the next year. But a lot of that happens to all running backs that are just getting a lot of touches within a year. And also generally they're coming off huge touch seasons because the season just went really well in all aspects. Team did well, players stayed healthy, and there's some regression that has nothing to do with injury that just generally tends to happen with these top backs. So I think if you just look at a list of like the really high touch backs in the year after, you could scare yourself a little bit and think, oh my God, I can't take Saquon. It's a lot. It's too risky. And I think that's probably, that analysis is not nuanced enough. As far as the CMC stuff, it's definitely a little bit recency bias. I think especially the way it happened last year in terms of like the team being a little coy and like we kind of thought he was fine. I was honestly like kind of making fun of people for not being willing to take him like in drafts in August. I'm like, and then, you know, I got my face with how that turned out. But he's also had, you know, 3 seasons in his career where he's missed, you know, a chunk of time. Although one of those I think was like because of he just didn't return from the previous year's injury. So I just think there's a couple seasons on the books. With that said, I think as we get closer to the season and the reports are good on him, I'll start to move him up. It's tough for me to break the ties. I do agree with you. Like if you gave me full health on Saquon and full health on CMC in a PPR league, and you guaranteed both these guys play a full season, I'm taking CMC. You know, the pass catching is just such an enormous difference. And it's not like he's not efficient as a runner and didn't have breakaway runs with San Francisco either. Like he led the league in rushing in 2023. So let's not like in rushing touchdowns too. The upside I think is just as strong as Saquon. So yeah, it's a tough conversation. I think it's everyone's risk tolerance, and I wish I had a better answer for you as far as like quantifying how much more risk he has than Saquon, but I just really don't know. It might be 0. I think it could be as low as 0% more risk, and it could be as high as like, you know, 33% more risk. I really don't know.
Right. But we agree there's definitely more risk with CMC, and I think rightfully so. But another big part of his profile that you just mentioned with the rushing being really strong is that he has had a really strong receiving TD rate as well. And I do think if he's healthy, it helps Brock Purdy's ceiling, because they've done some stuff with him going back to 2023 and earlier when he was healthy in the red zone, splitting him out, doing some things that he can be a matchup problem. And then it helps the pass TD rate a little bit when you have him on the field. I will say, as far as the backups, Isaac Guerendo, sometimes I talk about the targets per route for running backs in terms of whether the team was getting the ball to that player with intent versus just like a check down. Jordan Mason ran 170 routes, had a 9% targets per route. Guerendo was up at 15%. CMC is usually around 20. But what we got with Guerendo was closer to CMC than like what Mason was doing, which was just not being used in the pass game at all. They did seem to really like him. He was really good with his efficiency as a receiving back as well. Limited number of routes, only 107 routes, but had a 9.5 yards per target. Just generally speaking, Guerendo's 5 yards per carry and 9.5 yards per target is a really strong efficiency profile that I'm guessing will be rewarded. Like I'm guessing that deserves like a kind of a role, and maybe that cuts into CMC's like total volume, because I did end up projecting him lower than, like, if you just look at his healthy games, like I would be projecting him for even more volume than I was, but I'm projecting him to have a second running back be more involved than there was in 2023, and for that guy to mostly be Garendo rather than the rookie Jordan James, whose profile is okay. But one of the notes I had on him was that Lynch, right after the draft, said that James doesn't necessarily have top end speed. And then he did go on to compliment his burst and his hands and his physicality and all this stuff. But like, when most GMs are saying really positive stuff, like, the play speed is super fast and the time speed is deceptive, he's like straight up being like, yeah, no, that's a limitation. Like, I got the impression they kind of see him as more of a role player, but you never want to be completely out on a rookie running back with the Niners.
Let's go to wide receiver, which is, I don't want to say a mess to figure out, but it's important to try and figure out, given the upside and the efficiency that we've talked with Purdy and this team likely to score more touchdowns, and that swinging back to a decent amount of passing touchdowns. Juwan Jennings, we both have as the lead in targets. I don't think either of us are seriously factoring in any of the holdout rumors that just recently. Rumors might even be the wrong word, but the threat of a holdout right now, not factoring that in. So we've got 103 targets. You're at 98 targets.
I docked him 1% target share to comment on that. Yeah.
Yeah, we're probably, I don't think we docked him at all, or maybe 0.5%. The note I did want to make on Jennings is he was very good last year. Like, he wasn't just a routes play. Like, in my mind, it was like, oh, they had a lot of injuries and they needed to throw the ball to someone. He had a 28.7% target per route run with 8.6 yards per target. That's just phenomenal to do that type of efficiency on that type of volume.
Yep. Yeah, I mean, turns 28. I have a note that he turns 28 this month, which maybe he already did by the time we're recording this. And so the targets per route stuff can be a little different depending on what is classified as a route. I have it at 25.7%, a little lower than the number you just gave. But on my numbers, Pearsall's all the way at 14.4%. So people have, and I want to hear your take on Pearsall, because you told me you have a take, and I don't even know if it's good or bad. I'm very excited about this. But my thought on Pearsall was, when he first got back from the gunshot, which obviously cost him a ton of time, they got him some manufactured volume in his first couple of games. And then he went several games and was really doing nothing, but was playing a lot. And I think the people that are really in on him are maybe overlooking that stretch a little bit, is the one point I want to make. So he had targets of 5, 4, and 6, a game target totals of 5, 4, and 6. And then while playing at least 50% of the snaps, he went 2, 0, 1, and then he played 49% of the snaps, 2. There's a 4-game stretch where he has 5 targets in 4 games where he played 30 plus offensive snaps every one of those games, and then 4 in each of the next 2 games. And then he closes the season with the 2 games that a lot of people have talked about, that when he was finally ready, he has this 2-game stretch at the end. That's awesome. He had a 10 target game, 8 catches, 141 and a TD, and then an 8 target, 6 catch, 69 and a TD game as well. Now that was after the Niners had been eliminated, and in my opinion, we're sort of, again, seemingly trying to get him involved and sort of force feeding him to a certain degree. We want to build on this. Now, he was very good when he was being quote unquote force fed. Even if you buy that, I think he was very productive in those games in a meaningfully positive way. When I look at the full body work and see the targets per route, that's basically half of what Jennings had. And he was running a lot of routes at that same time that was after Aiyuk's injury. Most of his routes were after Aiyuk's injury. They were without CMC in the offense, and they were after Debo had the pneumonia and was struggling. And so they needed somebody to step up. And I felt like they were trying to give him every opportunity to step up. And I guess I was a little bit more disappointed in Pearsall's rookie year than I think most people were. And so a little bit concerned about that middle stretch where he really didn't earn a lot of volume, and that it really consolidated at the beginning when he first came back, and then the last couple games.
So we have probably had our most, I don't want to say contentious, but I'll go with contentious arguments in Slack over Ricky Pearsall, probably more so than any player. Adam and Silva, kind of the football guys, are very on Ricky Pearsall. This is what Evan told me in Slack. Hyper explosive first round pick in a hyper efficient offense with question marks about virtually every other member of the pass catcher corps. Not sure what's not to like. Isn't this the type of guy you'd want to aggressively get on your fantasy teams?
The listeners are going to note that you just changed your voice to a Silva voice, and it was pretty great.
I think I did like quarter Silva.
Yeah, it was a quarter Silva.
Silva. My response to that is kind of like, I don't think any of that in a vacuum is necessarily wrong, but when you're making like purely qualitative arguments, you can really make anyone sound pretty good or pretty bad. The difficult job is like trying to look at the whole picture and weight everything properly. So yes, I think there's a lot of upside to Ricky Pearsall. He's very athletic. He was a former first round pick. This is an offense you kind of can see upside happening on. And there's just a wide range of outcomes on Ricky Pearsall. The thing I come back to, which I think is matching with what you're saying, is it does feel a little bit like people are overconfident that he's good and they're misremembering last season. Like I went in this offseason, and I mentioned this on the Bills podcast, but I'm seeing Keon Coleman with a higher yards per route run on more routes than Ricky Pearsall, and no one cares. And everyone's acting like Pearsall, like, oh, we got to like react to this first season. It wasn't that, it was fine. It was like a normal kind of production. And I'd also push back against and you did in noting this as well. It wasn't just that like, oh, he started slow coming back from, the gunshot injury. He had a stretch, and JJ Zachariason in his prospect guide does a year 2 model, noting that Ricky Pearsall's year 2 score in his model is decently below Keon Coleman's and in line with Xavier Legette's. And he notes that Pearsall had this stretch, which was after he was clearly out of the woods with the injury and playing, of 3 games where he ran 63 routes and didn't gain a single yard. So yes, he finished the last 2 games very well, but you can't act like this stuff before that didn't happen.
And the big point about that is that what everything Silva had said, which I do think is really meaningful, and is why we're talking about this so much, because we talk about that hyper athleticism in this offense where they can create yak opportunities that could be really exciting. But the big issue with his profile was that the production in college wasn't necessarily there. He didn't earn big volume. He's a 5-year guy that didn't have the like typical analytical production profile. It was a projection on athleticism. And then you see in year 1, yes, he missed a lot of time in practice and stuff last year, but I'll note he has a hamstring injury this offseason that's already costing him more time this offseason. And that's concerning to me when we want to see this guy getting reports right now that he's back in perfect health and looks amazing in camp. And instead we're hearing that he's not practicing.
Part of the reason he didn't rate as high in JJ's year 2 model, like you said, like it wasn't a great production profile. He's an older prospect, and he did get drafted earlier than he was, expected by consensus. So yes, he was a first round pick, but it's the very end of round 1, and it went earlier than kind of he was supposed to. So the other thing I want to add, digging in a little deeper, because people are talking about like how it's a mess around him. And obviously Deebo Samuel's gone. Like we haven't brought that up. Everyone listening knows that, but like that's part of it too, is like Deebo's gone. If you look at only routes when Deebo was off the field last year, Pearsall was a distant 4th in targets per route run, behind Aiyuk, behind Jennings, behind Kittle. We haven't even brought up that all this time's happening without CMC playing. Now we've got CMC, who we've already talked about really increasing the amount of target share that's going to go to running backs that didn't happen last year, but maybe even changing the play calling of the offense entirely in a way that's less plays and less passes. So all this is probably making us sound probably more anti-Pearsall than we are. It's just trying to look at the whole picture, because you don't want to stop at ton of upside for a year 2 guy who's super athletic in an offense where there's opportunity for that to shine. Yes, that's true, but you do want to look at the whole picture. I don't think he's like the worst pick at ADP or anything, but I do think like he's about at as rich of a cost right now as I'd be willing to bet on. If he got more expensive, I'd be out.
Yeah, I'm not taking a lot of him here. I could see taking him, especially with the Jennings stuff. I mean, if Jennings is, that's the other part of it for me. You do the math on like, okay, well, last year there was a lot of names ahead of him, and that's why I wasn't really as in on him, even as a a double-digit round pick last year. Was like probably needs a lot of injuries in front of him, and he kind of got that, to be clear. Obviously, I keep mentioning the gunshot thing because the counter you'll always get is, well, I mean, probably you're just being, too harsh on a guy who had a gunshot wound and didn't get a practice and all that. And like, if your whole case is that he was this bad for 2 months of the NFL season because he missed so much practice time last year, then, I mean, you do have to recognize that that's your whole case, because he was that type of a prospect as well, to a degree, and not earning huge volume. Like, I do think you can give him leniency on that, but you also would have liked to see more, right? In the playing time that he actually had is, I think, the point that we're making. You don't want that to be your whole case, is sort of what I'm trying to emphasize. So, but the other thing I was going to say is he had all these guys ahead of him. The Juwan Jennings breakout, which we're both saying the numbers look really favorable. And as long as he does get the contract stuff sorted out and isn't, holding out, if McCaffrey's back and impacting the running back target share, and Jennings, and then especially later in the year when Aiyuk's back and Kittle, you're still fifth on the team. You have to be a target earner to make some waves now. Like, you have to be able to find volume.
Fifth on a low volume pass offense.
On a low volume pass offense. You mentioned Debo. I'll say this: if they use a wide receiver in the run game any kind of way to replace some of Debo's stuff, probably is Pearsall. I don't think they're necessarily going to do that. It seemed like Debo specific stuff, but I will say that, like, I could see them seeing Pearsall as the Debo replacement with some of that type of, play calling. That's about all that I can really get super excited about, other than just hope that he's better than what he was as a prospect and what he was in year one, which, I mean, draft capital, athleticism, you can hope some of that stuff, but you don't want to take that too far.
Yeah. 100% aligned. If we're too light on Pearsall, it's probably either discounting the Jennings holdout risk, or should we just completely bury Brandon Aiyuk coming back from injury? We both have Aiyuk for around 70 targets. We're assuming 5 to 6 missed games in that. That is a pro in Pearsall's column, where there's an element of like, he's going to get his chances early, and if he does well, maybe that sticks. And we're kind of doing it all at once in terms of our projections. And there might be, some more positives for Pearsall with, a lot of times with the younger breakout player, you're hoping he like earns the playing time by the end of the season. He's going to get his chance early to kind of show what he can do, because it's just DeMarcus Robinson, Jacob Conley behind him. But yeah, thoughts on like situations where you would draft Aiyuk?
I'm willing to take a decent amount of him because he's so cheap now that I think it's like about sort of where the upside profile is kind of, for me, at wide receiver like a wide receiver window closes around round 9. Sometimes he goes after basically all the other meaningful upside profiles, or maybe there's a couple still hanging out, a couple rookies or things like that. But this is a guy that was going in the second round last year. And I talked about how it's pretty tough to see him be even more efficient than he was coming off a 3+ yards per out run season the year prior. And I was a little out on him last year, but I fully acknowledge the reason he was going in the second round last year is because at his peak, Brandon Aiyuk was viewed as a really, really good wide receiver, potentially more talented than Juwan Jennings and clearly Ricky Pearsall and every other receiver in this passing game by a lot. Like, people were talking about him as a top 10 overall wide receiver 1 year ago. And then he held out and he had a slow start, and then he tore his ACL. Turns 27 in March, or he just turned 27 in March. Sorry. He's right in his prime. Just got paid last offseason. Still a big part of their future. People, I think, are way too confident that he can't get back to a level of play. And his ACL tear was reasonably early. So this is a situation where I don't project full health because I don't expect him to be ready for week 1. They're not talking about it like he's going to be ready for week 1. If we know the guy's going to not be ready for week 1, I do cut his target share in my projection. I cut him 6 games, like you said you did as well. I assumed just a 21% target share and then cut that down to 11 games worth. So, for the full season, it gives them like 13.5% of their targets. I do think I take him. I think he's interesting and managed, where you basically have your early season starting lineup set, and he's your bench receiver. He's going to be a little bit of a roster clogger in that scenario, and you're going to have to hold him. And I do think there are discussions, and it's tougher in best ball, I would say, but I do think there are discussions to be had about him in the late season being like just stepping all over Pearsall, being meaningfully better than Pearsall, and probably being better than Jennings. And I don't think that's being discussed enough for what his price is.
Yeah, I'm always a little bit worried about any of the injury guys. I will say, even for best ball, though, like you should be able to get through the first 6 weeks of the season at where his cost is. Like it's not that different than taking, a rookie wide receiver that you're hoping ascends like the second half of the season. It's not bad to have that archetype, in a certain wide receiver room where you're like, I got a lot of vets on this team. Even though Aiyuk's a vet, he does feel like hey, I want a guy who's going to maybe smash the second half of this season type of role for your best ball team. Let's go to Kittle. Sure. Projections for us always have a tough time with him. I actually made an edit after I saw your projections before we went on here. We raised his yards per target to 10.2. You're at 10.6. Our yards per target.
So silly.
What's insane is we were at, I think, 9.7. That was the highest we had on any player. And I raised him a half yard. And that puts us ahead of ADP on him. It's just such an outlier efficiency that I think he's a solid pick. I'm trying to middle, I don't want to overly regress him, but I don't want to overly IKB the model. But he's at 10.1 yards per target for his career. And he just set back-to-back highs with 11.3 and 11.8. Right. And last year in particular had a huge spike in catch rate. I think he caught 80% of his balls, which helps offset some of the lack of total volume, which is the one thing that keeps him behind being a truly elite tight end in a fantasy sense. It helps offset it. There's a reason why he doesn't go up with McBride and Bowers. We're going to get to talk about McBride on this podcast. But I'm pretty in on Kittle at cost right now, or at least I think he's a solid pick at cost. I maybe earlier in the offseason was I think maybe we're trying too hard here, but just after looking closer at the efficiency, it's just this guy's kind of just on his own island here in terms of how we need to project him.
You mentioned I have him at a 10.6 yards per target. He's the only player I'm projecting over 10 as well. You're previously you had him as your highest at 9.7. I don't have a single wide receiver over 10. As I dig into his numbers, I mean, he was at 11.8 last year, 11.3 the year prior. You just mentioned it, 2 back-to-back career highs, a 10.1 for his career. His low seasons, and I think this is the point about why you can project him at a base level above 10. His rookie year, he was at 8.2. Since then, his lowest yards per target has been 8.9. He has a 9.7, a 9.8, a 10.1, a 10.1. I mean, every year he's right around 10 yards per target, which is both the catch rate. It's the yak. He's elite. I mean, we know that. And he was straightforwardly exceptional last year, probably the best year of his career. Turns 31 in October. He's still years behind Kelsey and Ertz types. He's not, people talk about him like he's getting old, and he is getting old, but for tight end production, I mean, you still see production at age 31. There's, I think, some concern that, an age cliff could eventually come, but I'm not that worried about it when he did what he did last year. 2.62 yards per route run. I mean, just absolutely elite. I think that the issue is, as you were saying, he was 15th in tight end routes, and CMC ran just 91 routes total last year. Aiyuk ran just 215. I think, you're talking about the target competition being significantly stronger this year, even with Debo moving on. And so he needs the efficiency because the routes are not going to be elite in this offense. He has that efficiency, but I do think he's meaningfully behind those top two. I see some people talk about him being as one of the biggest underpriced guys because he's tight end 3. And I don't see that either. I do think he's the clear tight end 3, and he's meaningfully ahead of the rest of the tight end position, which I think gets weak fairly quickly this year. And so I do like him because I think there's a kind of a drop off behind him, but I would never take him over. Like you said, comparing him to McBride, I would never take him over McBride personally, just because of the way the range of volume could go for those two guys.
Let's go to Seattle. I'm at 61.9 plays per game. Gretch is at 61. So we both have them below average. Take into account Gretch's note about us being a little higher in plays systemically. Called pass rate, we're at 60.6%. Gretch is at 58.5. Don't have a ton of confidence in that pass rate number or that discrepancy, to be honest. I do think this is a team that has signaled they want to run the ball a bit more. We probably are going to see some 2 tight end sets out of Seattle. But I was just going to say their margin of victory in terms of projected swing, they're projected to be a little bit worse than last year in terms of game script.
That's right. They brought in Clint Kubiak. They hired Ryan Grubb, so I'm from the Seattle area, and I hear a lot of the local scuttlebutt here. So I have probably stronger opinions on this than most. They hired Ryan Grubb out of the University of Washington, my alma mater here, and also in Seattle last year after McDonald took over as the head coach. And so you hire this coordinator in year one, and then he does basically what he was expected to do, which is build a pretty pass-first offense. And their offense wasn't good, but it wasn't terrible. It wasn't the kind of year that you would expect a first-year coordinator to get fired after, I think, in my opinion. And the big writing around here has been it was purely because of essentially that he called too many pass plays. It was purely because of I can't think of the word, but the
like philosophical
reasons. Exactly. That's the word I'm looking for. The direction of the offense. They've pointed to the game in week 5 against the Giants specifically. Like there was an article, I think, in the Seattle Times that wrote this up. That was the turning point. McDonald wanted Grubb to run more in the second half. They lost a home game against the Giants. They ended up going 10-7 and losing the division on a tiebreaker and missing the playoffs. They had started 3-0. That was during a stretch in their season where their season went really poor before the bye. They went into the bye 4-5. I think they went 1-5 over 6 games. And they lost to the Giants at home. The Giants came in and ran all over them. Tyrone Tracy had a big game. And the Seahawks threw way too much for McDonald's liking. And it seemed like there was, from that point forward, a fracture. And Grubb was fired at the end of the year. They bring in Clint Kubiak, who is Shanahan's system, run the ball, outside zone, use the run to set up the pass, all of those types of things. Kubiak worked under Kyle Shanahan. Kyle Shanahan worked under Gary Kubiak. Gary Kubiak worked under Mike Shanahan. These families are inextricably connected. I think they brought him in almost explicitly to run the ball more, to develop a better run game. The Saints last year were decently paced, but below average in plays, and they leaned run heavy. Alvin Kamara had a much bigger rushing workload last year per game than he really ever had in his whole career. He was pacing, I think he ended up with his most touches of his career, pacing to have his most rush attempts, but I think he got hurt before he could hit that number. So I have these guys settling on a pretty big run lean. They also brought in Jalen Milroe, I'll note, and I have him playing a little bit, not like a ton, but I have him getting 22 rush attempts, which is a little, 1.5 per game or something, similar to what the Ravens did with Lamar Jackson in his rookie year. There's been some comparisons of the athleticism of Milroe. There was somebody who recently said Milroe's maybe the only quarterback in the league faster than Lamar Jackson. Can't remember where I heard that quote recently, but they've talked about putting packages in specifically to utilize his athleticism. And I referenced that Lamar Jackson rookie year when he was coming in when Flacco was the main quarterback and doing some run plays because Mike McDonald was on staff on that team. He wasn't the defensive coordinator yet. I think he was like the linebackers coach, but he comes over to Seattle from the Ravens. And they've drawn that direct connection. So I think that's going to also push their run lean, that they're going to be doing some actual packaged plays with Jalen Milroe. So anyway, I shifted their run lean down an extra 0.5 to 1%. I wrote toward the run because of the presence of Milroe. But I do expect this team to be pretty run heavy.
Yeah. And I want to circle back on the Milroe stuff when we get to receiver, but let's skip over quarterback for the time being then and get to Kenneth Walker. You've got 241 rush attempts. We're at 213. You've got 68 targets. We're at 50. Curious if you've got a lean on Walker being still a pretty clear workhorse here, or we kind of talked about how your projections run a little bit hotter to begin with, if the difference is more attributed to that. So is this a pro Walker lean, or just kind of giving a little bit more to the starter?
Charbonnet was good last year. Kenny McIntosh was even a good RB3. I think this is a good running back room. I think they think Kenneth Walker is like one of the very best running backs in the league. They talk about him really favorably. If you listen to the stuff the coaching staff's saying, his missed tackle force stuff last year, by the way, was absolutely absurd. It was like 0.37 missed tackles forced per touch, which like 0.3 is elite. He was pushing 0.4, which is like what Ashton Genty did in college was the 0.4 stuff. Like you don't even see college guys pushing that number. Now, why did that not show up in his production? He had the lowest yards before contact rate in the league. And some of that's on him. He runs laterally. He's breaking tackles, but he's not actually getting into space. That's not purely an O-line stat that he was getting such poor yards before contact because he does like to dance some. I think the whole reason they brought in Clint Kubiak, this is a little bit more of a, art than science take. So to answer your question directly, it's not that I have a strong lean that they could like Charbonnet more than last year because he was good. And it's like kind of the tough thing I've toyed with as far as how high I am on Walker, but I'm very high on Walker. I think the Kubiak outside run scheme is to get these explosive runners, and I think Charbonnet is more of a downhill runner to the edge. And I really think Walker could be sort of obviously not Saquon Barkley, but this year's version in the sense that you get those missed tackle force numbers to the second level because you improve the yards before contact, which is basically what Saquon got coming over from the Giants to the Eagles. Great blocking, get him onto the edge, get him to the second level, and now he's really tough for linebackers and safeties as opposed to, when he was still in New York having to try to break tackles in the backfield. The thing about Ken Walker is he's breaking those tackles in the backfield all last year on the D lineman and stuff. But if the scheme can help him get into space, I think his home run hitting ability and get him more downhill, I think his home run hitting ability plays up. And then you start to see the high rate of long touchdown runs come into play that we saw with Saquon. Like that's where the comparison would be for me. And so I don't know. I think Ken Walker is a really big upside play in whatever it is, round 4 for most people. I would take him as high as round 3.
Yeah, I really like Kenneth Walker as well. There's like a mini Achane comparison for me in terms of, we talk about Achane having we have 1 year on the books with insane efficiency. Then we saw the workload. It just didn't happen together. We know Kenneth Walker has some special characteristics as a running back that just not a lot of running backs have. Like, quite frankly, there's the haves and have-nots there, and he's one of the haves. And now you've got an organization that going into last year, people were very worried that they wouldn't give Kenneth Walker as much volume as they did. And they, as you said, they just seem to really like him. So I kind of echo those sentiments, maybe slightly less bullish. I still like Charbonnet too. Honestly, I kind of like, if this team runs more and is more successful running, I could see Charbs having a touch of standalone value. And I just like that we saw last year when Walker was out, we got the full workload from Charbonnet. We're not guessing. I don't think McIntosh would cut into that. I think we'd see a heavy dose of Charbs, which is nice. Now he's being priced kind of like as that, but I still do like that.
I like him too.
Yeah,
I think it's a good take. I will note also, and this goes for both backs, McDonald has talked this offseason about the need to run in the red zone specifically. And they talked about how, he's an analytics focused coach. Comes over from the Ravens, who's a very, analytics focused organization. And one of the areas that even the analytics that for years were like teams should throw more, they've always kind of said that once the field gets condensed and you get in the red zone, that's actually when teams should be running a lot. And I think we've started to see some of that on some of these offenses where some of the rushing TDs are taking over, like your Bills. That happened to them the last couple of years. I think this is a low-key team where you could see a lot more rush TDs than pass TDs, where they try to really use this scheme, this Clint Kubiak scheme in the red zone specifically. So that's, I think, great for Ken Walker. I think it's great for Sharps as well for the cases you're making.
Okay, let's go to wide receiver. I mentioned circling back on Darnold versus Milroe. I'm really struggling with Jackson Smith and Jigba, where he's going right now, where our projections really like him, think he has a lot of upside. I'm assuming he's got to play in two wide receiver sets. I heard some rumblings that he might not. That just seems crazy to me, given what they have behind him. And we know in those 2 wide receiver sets, the targets per out run stuff is better for the wide receivers than in other sets. He was a prospect we liked a lot disappointing year one, has the year two breakout. I really want to be in on him. And then there's just part of me that's like JSN with Milroe in the playoff weeks and what that could do to the team pass volume for Seattle. So I'm really curious to hear how you feel about JSN and how you're approaching him in drafts.
No, I think that's a great point that I hadn't really considered, is because I do think Milroe playing late in the year is fairly possible. Sam Darnold was very good for the Vikings last year and needs credit for it, but had been much worse for a long time in his career, and then did look really bad in a must-win Week 18 and a must-win playoff game in a way that Kevin O'Connell basically was like, we love Sam Darnold, but like from his post-game press conference after that loss in the playoffs, he's, basically starting the narrative that we were not going to have him back and have a QB competition in Minnesota. They basically didn't want him back. They wanted to move forward with JJ McCarthy. I think they felt like, or my read on it, because Kevin O'Connell's a very motivational coach if you listen to him talk, and so he still said very positive things, but you kind of have to read between the lines, at least the way that I was looking at it. And then I think the Seahawks whole offseason, and especially free agency, was interesting because they took that piece from Darnold that was maybe a piece that Minnesota didn't want back. They took Cooper Kupp, who was like in Sean McVay's wedding and is like breakfast buddies with Matthew Stafford and stuff. And the Rams were like, under no circumstances are we going to have Cooper Kupp back. We just don't think he can play anymore. And so they're taking all these, IKB bets. Like they're the I know better team this offseason, where they felt like they could find guys to fit to their scheme. So this is one of the things I think they did wrong, sort of from a team building perspective, is they're trying to fit talent to scheme instead of fitting scheme to the talent they have. They're trying to bring in guys that make sense in this McShanny system. Darnold, Kupp, obviously having played with the Rams for years. But if those guys can't play anymore, that's a problem. They also brought in MVS, who had like a couple plays last year with the Saints, but I think he had 19 catches total. Like if you go look at Marcus Valdes-Scantling's stats over the course of his career, just his raw stats, that guy's done a lot less than what I think most people who played fantasy football would expect, especially considering the offenses he's played for. But yeah, he had 19 catches last year, had 21 the year prior. These guys never had 700 yards receiving in a year. He's probably not he played with Aaron Rodgers and Patrick Mahomes. He's probably not very good. And they brought him in to basically potentially take routes from JSN, as you were saying. So anyway, I'm a little bit concerned about the pass game. I'm concerned about Darnold's fit behind a tough offensive line. He's a pressure-sensitive quarterback. A lot has been made about that. Geno probably covered up pressure issues last year. There was that Sunday night game against the Packers where Geno got hurt. Sam Howell came in. The defense played great and kept getting the ball back in a one-score game, and Sam Howell was just getting pummeled back there, could not handle the pressure. And I think really reinforced for a lot of people that were watching that Geno was elevating the situation, playing well under pressure. His pressure numbers are good. Darnold's are not as strong in terms of, again, pressure, being a pressure-sensitive quarterback and those things. And so I'm concerned about their pass game. I'm concerned about the way it was constructed and the way that it goes forward. And I do think the season could go a little bit awry for them in a way that you do have Milroe late. And if Milroe's playing late, I think you're right. With his mobility, that's not great for JSN. I love JSN. Legit breakout. After DK Metcalf's Week 7 injury, posted a 2.35 yards per out run the rest of the way. The first 6 games, he ran a ton of routes. That's when they were throwing a crazy amount. So his overall number for the year is like 1.8 yards per out. But if you just look at that stretch where he really became a part of the offense when Metcalf went down in Week 7, missed a little bit of time, you really see the breakout, and you see that maybe isn't there in the full season number because of the just sheer routes of volume. But I have a hard time with him for the reasons, the reasons that I've said. On Kupp, I'll note that his yak per reception cratered, his missed tackles forced per touch cratered, his yards per target wasn't horrible, but he's just not the same guy after the catch. And I just don't know where the playmaking comes in this offense other than JSN, but I'm also pretty concerned about the offense as a whole, the passing offense.
Yeah, it's so tricky on JSN. And when we get to Marvin Harrison for Arizona, I might ask you more of a direct comparison between those two, because it's a point in the draft that's just tricky where I'm like, if I liked guys better, I think I could much more easily say, like, I'm not going to take on this Milroe risk with JSN, but I don't. And Devontae Adams, who we're talking about with the Rams, goes in that range too. So we'll just kind of keep that back of mind when we talk about those two wide receivers and do some comparisons. I'm with you in terms of the Kupp concerns. a lot of times changing situations, uncertainty is a good thing. I feel like the uncertainty works more against Kupp than for him. Like downgrading quarterback, downgrade in home stadium, another year older, another year dealing with injuries. You mentioned the after the catch stuff. So we are pretty below ADP on Kupp, and I don't think that will likely change for us. At tight end, mentioned they could play more 2 tight end sets. They do have Noah Fant as the incumbent here. Drafted Elijah Arroyo. This is all best ball stuff here. I don't think there's anything here for redraft, but you're taking a tight end 3 late in best ball. Do you prefer the vet or an upside swing with Arroyo?
I'm probably taking Fant. They signed him. So I've had some people mention to me that he might be cut. I've had a couple people mention this. I don't get it. It would save about $9 million in unguaranteed salary, but it would also cost them about $4.5 million in dead money on a contract they signed last year after McDonald was already on board. They signed him to do a 2-year deal. I just don't think a team. I think they see more out of what he does. Like a lot of tight ends, they're blocking and different things than what the fantasy community is seeing about what he is. I think they drafted Arroyo to be kind of the guy who takes over in 2026 for this role. But it'd be kind of odd to eat so much dead money on a 2-year extension signed last offseason by the same head coach and GM combo just to make them thinner at a position they drafted highly, which, by the way, they have a lot of available cap room. It wouldn't save them. They're like 10th in effective cap space right now. It would save them a bunch of money that they can't use at this point in the offseason, and they already have money that they can't use. So anyway, I think Fant's going to be there. I think he's going to be the tight end 1 this year, and I think Arroyo then is taking over sort of the year after that. Their rookie last year, AJ Barner, was pretty interesting. And from what I understand, kind of plays a slightly different tight end role than Fant, and Arroyo is kind of in the Fant lane. And so Barner, even on those 2 tight end sets, it may be some Fant and Barner, and then maybe it's Arroyo and Barner later in the year or something like that. But the presence of a reasonable tight end 3, I think, also hurts Arroyo's case to be meaningful in 2025. Yeah, I probably wouldn't take either of them, but I don't think I could take Arroyo.
Let's go to Arizona. In terms of play calling, we're at 63, right around league average. Gretch is at 61.8 for Arizona. They were at were they last year? I'm looking at we have it split out by like real plays, which strips out some stuff, but they were in the low 60s last year. I don't know if you have the exact comparable number there, Gretch. But we did
60.9, yeah.
60.9. So about 61. We're closer to league average. Again, we have the league average bouncing back a little bit this year, which might not be correct. And so that's part of the reason discrepancy. And we did have on their pace stuff, them being a little bit more neutral than the plays run kind of indicated, but no strong feeling there. In terms of called pass rate, we're identical, 60% called pass rate. They're going to be, a negative PROE team, but not insanely so. And puts them with a relatively neutral pass rate, all said and done. When we go to...
I would just say real quick on that, Jack Miller had some great notes in his piece contextualizing some of that stuff from last year, that they got a little more pass heavy down the stretch last year, but they were also less effective during that period, and it probably wasn't a reflection of what they want to be. And so I at this pass rate, I was kind of seeing them as relatively run heavy and then also a little bit slower paced as a result.
Yeah, that makes sense. We've got Kyler with 312 fantasy points. You're at 338. Pretty similar numbers. We have slightly more rush attempts, but less rushing efficiency, so it kind of offsets. So we're identical, just over 500 yards rushing, just under 5 rushing touchdowns. Passing stuff, you're a little bit higher on yards at 4,000 and 26.5 touchdowns, but that's kind of the general bias with our stuff being a little bit less rosy on the efficiency standpoint. I think Kyler's a decent value, but it's not to the extent where I think there's a lot of quarterback opportunities this year, so it's hard for me to be like, yeah, get Kyler, in your draft sort of thing.
I think when Kyler was a top 5 quarterback in drafts, there was reason to believe he could be a really high-end passer. That's probably not what he's been able to become. I guess I probably at this point think that the height stuff has actually been somewhat of a limitation for him. And then the other note is that he was a really good rusher. 4.6 rush attempts per game last year, far below his previous low of 5.5. So this is a really key note in 2024 under a new coaching staff. The main culprit was the design run rate cratered for him. That came up in the offseason pressers that he ran less last year. And there were some questions asked, and the response was they were not going to do anything different. I just think you're at this stage of Kyler's career and the way that they're designing their offense, they don't anticipate leaning on him as much as a runner as he was, again, earlier in his career in those first few years. So he's still going to have meaningful rushing upside, to be clear. I'm projecting him for 512 rushing yards. You guys got him at 515, but I am projecting that to be a little bit lower than I was probably projecting for him last year.
Yeah, and I think the point there is the pure ceiling just might not be there.
Right.
On both ends, being tougher for that to happen. So again, I think solid value, but not someone you have to be in on. Last year, James Conner was a tremendous value. I know early in the offseason, I was really on Trey Benson. That kind of burned me. I got more Conner as the offseason went along. This season, you've got Conner with 220 carries, 53 targets. We're at 192 carries and 40 targets. Part of that is I think we just have more kind of riff-raff projected. I always refer to it that way. In general, behind Conner and Benson, like we have DeMarcado with a bit more work, and we have some unlisted running back work for Arizona as well. But I'm curious if Conner stays healthy, do you see him having that workhorse role again, or do you think there's an opportunity for Benson to cut in without injury to Conner?
I think he keeps it. I again, in the offseason discussion, they talked about him that way. I think they think of him as like a dude, like their team captain. Like this is like, he's our workhorse. He's our heartbeat. He's our guy. I think Benson could still, sort of cut into some degree. But the other thing I'll note on him is that it wasn't just like okay last year. He was, I was given the stat a little bit ago, the missed tackles forced per touch. He was over 0.3 missed tackles forced per touch last year for the first time in his career. The year prior in 2023, he was up to 0.28, which was a significant career high. I think his previous career high was in the lower 0.2s, which is still like, okay, it's usable, but he took up his game in 2023 in terms of the peripherals, forcing missed tackles. His yards after contact per attempt was meaningfully, as high as it's been. I believe a career high as well. And then he did that again. He backed it up in 2024. He took the missed tackles force number to another level. The yards after contact came down a bit, but also was better than his previous career numbers. So he's getting up there in age, but he's playing arguably some of his best football. They run the ball in the red zone, so you have the touchdown thing. If Conner does miss time, he's 30 now. If he does miss time, I think some of the TDs maybe shift towards the pass a little. He's just been so good and close, and that's another reason that I like him to really still be that main heartbeat and to be their chief touchdown scorer as well. But yeah, I do like Benson a lot. I think there's no real threat at RB3. You have Emery, DeMarcado, and like DJ Dallas, who are like just basically third down backs and special teams help. And they see Benson as like their only other real running back. Michael Carter got a bunch of work. All 35 of his carries came at the very end of the year. He was not active until week 16 last year. He's still on the roster. But if you look at their season numbers and see, Michael Carter getting significant work, he was inactive for 15 straight games to start the season. I don't think they see him as a part of their future or anything at this point. So Benson is a fine handcuff, but I do think James Conner, once again, probably a little undervalued.
Okay, I'm going to ask you here as we go to wide receiver and talk Marvin Harrison. You're on the clock, middle of the third round. You got to pick between Jackson Smith and Jigba, Marvin Harrison, and Devontae Adams, the three receivers in this division with similar ADPs. Who are you going with?
It's a super tough range, as you mentioned. I think Harrison would be the hardest one for me to pick. So I think it would be between JSN or Adams. I guess I could see JSN really consolidating in Seattle in a way that I can't really with Harrison. I kind of describe both these teams similarly in terms of what I'm viewing. It's a defensive-oriented head coach whose defense might actually be a little better this year. I think both teams want to run the ball. If they're good, I think they're good because they're trying to run the ball, at least to some degree. I think there's more upside for pass volume in Arizona, but I also don't think Harrison has as clear of a path to being his number one target earner on his offense as JSN would. And so I guess I'm more on JSN from that perspective. And then Adams, I mean, we'll get there, but the target volume can be so consolidated there that he's a tricky one that I don't want to be out on, because especially if Puka Nacua were to miss time, I just feel like he'd get so much volume. So it's probably either Adams or JSN. I'd probably go JSN first and then Adams second, just from a health perspective. But as far as Harrison, as far as his projection goes, I think. Sorry, were you going to say something?
No, I was going to say that's basically how we have it right now with our rankings derived from our projections between the base and ceiling cases, which is JSN, then Adams, then Harrison.
Yeah, and I think that's the way I'd play it. As far as the Harrison situation, I will say that, like, I do think there's a pretty strong floor. You still have a ton of draft capital last year. I think the rookie year went about as bad as you can expect, and he still had 21% targets per route at a 14.8 ADOT, which is really high, which also created a weighted targets per route that wasn't bad. But to me, like, very clearly the ADOT just needs to come down. You're going to get the vertical stuff, but we need to see them use him in the short to intermediate range more so that he doesn't just look like a pure deep threat. Right. Like I heard someone compare him to early career Mike Williams with the Chargers. And one of the things the Chargers eventually did with Mike Williams is started to use him a little lower. I was looking at his numbers. His targets per out jumped like 4 percentage points one year as his ADOT came down multiple yards. And it basically was just he's now starting to get targets in the short and intermediate range that he wasn't getting before. Same deep profile that he had before, but now adding some additional targets short. Harrison needs that. In year two, the ADOT needs to come down. It will still be above average, and he'll still be getting the vertical stuff. I'm not saying he shouldn't get the vertical stuff. But anyway, 7.8 yards per target's not bad last year. 1.63 yards per out run, disappointing, but not disqualifying by any means. I think there's room for him to take a year two step forward. He was a good enough prospect that we should expect that. I also think he's in one of the worst situations probably for him, because I do think it's a bad fit with Kyler Murray. I think we saw that throughout most of last year. And I do think Trey McBride's probably going to see a ton of targets again this year. And then so it's a high floor, but I struggle to see the real ceiling. I do think he should get more volume. They should make room for him in the short and intermediate range. They should kind of artificially inflate his target rate in year two after a tough year one. And we'll probably see all that. And yet, and especially I should note, because there's no third target on this passing offense. I mean, Michael Wilson's a rotational deep threat, and you're down to Greg Dortch and Zay Jones. Like, those are the other names. So Harrison's going to be right there with McBride. It's a 1-2 punch with no clear 3 more than it's hey, he's the number 2 and there's number 3 and 4 are going to take targets from him. That's not going to happen in this offense. So anyway, it's a tricky one with Harrison.
It's tricky. Pretty much aligned. If I was playing the optimistic side of things, it would just be Harrison was such a strong prospect that the ceiling just comes from maybe he's really good and just kind of struggled year one, and we get like a JSN type breakout year two. And if that happens, like you said, there's room for him and McBride probably. And hopefully the offense would just be playing very well if McBride continued to play well and Harrison had that true breakout. I just thought we'd get more of a discount on him. I'm kind of surprised we're not. So
I don't mind taking him after those other receivers you talked about. Yeah. Like, if I get him to slide a little, then I'm like, all right, I'll take a bet on this, you know?
I don't think there's too much fantasy relevant behind that. Michael Wilson's a guy, sometimes I'll take late correlated in best ball because he probably is going to see routes due to, I mean, some of these teams in this division, there's like nothing at wide receiver 3 through 5. It's kind of crazy. I don't think there's too much to talk about there. Definitely have to talk about Trey McBride. We're pretty high on him with 128 targets. You're even higher at 144. The other discrepancies, we have him for 4.2 touchdowns. You're at 6.8. The touchdown rate, I'll note, our 4.2 is I've looked closely at it. I feel good about the projection, but if we were to miss, there's only so much room to miss worse than that. There's a lot of room for him to have, like he could have a 10 touchdown season. Like when you get this type of volume and you're a tight end, that's not out of the realm of the possibility. I do think he'll be a low TD rate guy, but just in terms of the range of outcomes for him and his ceiling, like he's got, like, there's just, the floor is like 3 touchdowns, even though we're projecting 4.2. So we've got McBride, especially in the tight end premium stuff. We do have him. He's starting to come up a little bit, but we have him a 1-2 turn pick on FFPC. When you get into DraftKings best ball, we've got him decently ahead of ADP. The volume is just going to be so good when those counting stats like really ratchet up in the full PPR stuff. We're still even neutral on him on underdog, so it's not like we're low on him. We just sometimes do have the market undervaluing these really high volume tight ends as you get into full PPR and 1.5 point premium scoring.
Yeah, and there's just on the touchdown rate, it's definitely a little bit of a guesswork. But I'm definitely very high on McBride. Like when we did the Bucks, and you were curious how I'd be on Bucky Irving because I was so high on him last year, and I was a little bit lower on him. This is a different one. I was tight end 1 on Trey McBride last year over Laporta, and I don't have him tight end 1 this year, but I'm playing the hits again this year with this one, Leone. I think he's insanely good. He matched his high targets per out run from the late 2023 stretch that I thought might carry over, but he took the routes up. He also added some yards per target in addition to that, which pushed his yards per route run to 2.14, second only to George Kittle in the league. He's had a massive catch rate over all 3 of his years. He's a lower ADOT, but he's got really good hands. He doesn't drop anything. His catch rates are meaningfully over 70%, which is tough to do with a little bit of depth to his target. But that's just, he's very good, right? I did note here, the touchdowns are the real issue. I liked seeing late last year, they knew he hadn't scored. He was really mad about it. For people that were, had a lot of McBride and were watching the sort of tracker of when was he going to catch his first touchdown late last year, they were like running plays to McBride every week for a stretch there, to the extent that like defenses were treating him like he had 15 touchdowns. They were like shading defenders to him and stuff. And they eventually got him a TD. He scored again the next year. As far as I'm concerned, I think for McBride and the Cardinals, this was at least a somewhat meaningful thing. A lot of these types of things are just so narrative based, but I guess that they come out this year and actually like meaningfully get him a couple touchdowns in the season's first month to get him on the board early so that they don't get in the same situation. Like, I think you're right that he's going to probably be a lower touchdown rate guy for most of his career, but I think 2025, he's going to have some early TDs and wind up. I bumped his TD rate because of that. I think they're going to try to get him early touchdowns this year. That's the flag plant.
Yeah, I would say they tried really hard to get him touchdowns last year, and he still went too. No, like I said, there's way more room to grow than to not. But every time I'm like, man, we must be too low. I'm like, 6 touchdowns on 292 targets. It's just wild.
It's not great.
But I mean, in some ways it's a bonus where he's like, we have him at 4 touchdowns as a good pick, a solid pick. Right. If you're optimistic like Ben and you have more touchdowns and even a little bit more targets to begin with, then he's like very clearly a good pick. Let's go to
tight end premium, a very strong pick, right?
Yeah. Let's go to the Rams. We're both a little bit below average or right around average in play calling, just over 62 plays per game. Gretch is at 59.5% called pass rate. We're 58.8%. So very similar. We do kind of end up, when dotting the I's, crossing the T's, with us at 1 pass attempt per game lower than Gretch and 1 rush attempt per game higher than Gretch. As far as that's concerned for Stafford, Gretch a little bit higher on the YPA at 7.7. We're at 7.3. Generally, Gretch is about 0.2 to 0.3 higher than us. You're at 30 passing touchdowns. We're at 25 4,500 yards to 4,100 for us. So you're a little bit more optimistic on Stafford, which I don't mind. We might come up a little there. I mentioned players like Kittle that we have a tough time projecting. Stafford's been one too, because the play calling isn't that exciting and he doesn't run, but he is just so talented, and they do have the addition with Devontae Adams. Last year, obviously, struggles in terms of the wide receiver talent and depth.
Yeah, I think I'm really high on Stafford from a projection standpoint because I'm projecting health, and this is a very concentrated offense, and the efficiency is going to be there for the really good players. But I think when we did the last episode, we did the AFC West, I talked about the Chargers and their team building and being a fan of the redundancy they'd built into a lot of spots. The Rams for the last few years have been pretty thin in my mind. They've been able to hit on some rookies that have been, or like young players, draft picks, later round draft picks that have been meaningful contributors in a lot of places, which has been helpful. But I think they're still dealing a little bit with the fact that for a stretch there 4 or 5 years ago, they were trading their first round pick basically every year. And they don't have a ton of like late rookie contract talent other than, first round pick talent. I guess they do have later round pick talent. They have talent on this roster. It's a good team. My concern is something happens to Stafford, I think you're in a problem. Their offensive line has some high-end players, but has like poor grades at all the backup spots, which could be a low floor. Their receiving room, I think you lose Puka or you lose Adams or you have both miss some time. And I think that's a real problem for Stafford. And so the projection comes out rosier for me than how I feel. I think a lot of the contingent scenarios are tricky for the Rams.
Let's go to Kyren Williams, RB1. Holds off Blake Corum in a big way last year. You have him at 262 carries. We're at 227. We're both in the low 40s in terms of targets. That's out with us having him just shy of 200 half PPR points per game. You're at 225. So pretty similar projections after adjusting for the bias. The question with Kyren's more like, what type of bet is he? He's someone that on most of the full PPR sites where he's going, it's like kind of backwards. He's like going earlier on the full PPR sites where the markets there tend to like running backs a bit more. And I'm concerned there with the lack of pass catching volume, a lot of reliance on getting a ton of rush attempts and getting those rushing touchdowns and the offense being good. They've also drafted a running back each of the last 2 years. So in general, I'm underweight on Kyren, and someone in redraft, I'm probably not going to end up on my teams. I will say he is that underdog best ball profile where the market does not like players like Kyren Williams, even though he fits the scoring system and the best ball structure a lot better, that when you give him to me in round 4, I've been taking him.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, that on in a half point PPR site like Underdog and in best ball where, I mean, the idea of guaranteed touches or, that type of back can certainly matter more in best ball when you can't try to replace the production. But no, I'm with you. I'm very out on Kyren from basically any other format. 55 running back targets last year as a team is very low. And what's crazy is no more than 76 in any of the last 5 years. They're not even approaching 100 targets for the running back position any season. And now they add Devontae Adams, right? They're going to be more vertical with their passing game. They're still talking about Kyren as a clear number 1. I'm still projecting him to be the clear number 1. It's tough to have the same thesis as last year, though, where like he had a kind of a tough peripheral season, and then they draft another back. Like for the second straight year, they've drafted a back on top of him. And I mean, last year I wasn't as concerned about Corum because I felt like the expectation should have been that they were going to draft the back because they needed to replace the guy that they thought was going to be a big part of their running game going into the year prior, which was Cam Akers. And then it just became all Kyren's backfield in 2023 because Akers quickly got displaced and then was like traded or cut or whatever it was that 2023 season. So they needed to draft someone. They go get Corum. But to do it again this offseason, I do think it's tough to be like really confident that Kyren holds the work all year when, he's mostly a product of the volume. They mentioned Jarquez Hunter a lot in the offseason program. Not much about Corum. I do feel like Hunter's probably the probable number 2, and that Corum probably just didn't do what they were hoping for last year. And then also on Kyren's receiving, his when he does get targets, his yards per target was sub 4.5 for the second straight year. He's just not very good at it, which is part of the reason he hasn't seen targets. The running back average is about 6. And so he's been 25% worse than that. But one of the things about this offense is the running back 3, running back 4 are traditionally used very sparingly. If you go look at their past few years, it's Kyren and it's maybe the RB2's gotten some work. And the other guys like don't touch the ball throughout the season. It's kind of weird. So
yeah,
and there the whole year, he's going to get a lot of work.
And you mentioned Corum versus Jarquez. We've got Jarquez at 72 carries. You've got him at 85. We've got Corum with more at 91, and you've got him with a lot less at 35. And that might be a case of us maybe showing too much deference to the incumbent. I know JJ Zachariason likes Jarquez as a prospect, good speed scorer, kind of like fun guy to take a stab on. He's a little bit smaller, but so is Kyren. I think they're like virtually the same size. So yeah, it does sound like, you much prefer Hunter to Corum if you're taking a bench stash or late round upside gamble in best ball.
That's right. Yeah, I would prefer sort of the mystery box over the guy who had a tough first year, even though he has a little bit less draft capital. We talked about this on some other shows. I'm not really docking the guys in what was considered to be a deep class. And some of the GMs around the league have talked about knowing they could wait at RB in this class. Like, I think Hunter's a guy that could have arguably been a day 2 pick last year. But in this class, he ends up being a day 3 guy. But the fact that the timeline, the fact that Corum was a day 2 pick last year, didn't do a lot, and then they drafted Hunter this year is why I pretty strongly prefer the mystery box of the rookie.
Let's go to wide receiver, and this is a team that will concentrate targets. I don't have a lot of stands in the first round because I think it's so deep, but I really like Puka Nacua. 2.9 yards per route run as a rookie. Then he follows it up last season with another really strong outing, 3.3 yards per route run, absurd 38% target per route run. And kind of like we mentioned with Jauan Jennings, like the yards per target's good here too. It's not like, it's a lot of spam, but it's high quality spam. And Matt Stafford just has a history of making these types of wide receivers. I'm really in on Puka. I mean, just those 2 first years, the addition of Devontae Adams isn't scaring me off Puka as a first-round asset. How do you feel about him?
I'm with you. The targets per route run number that you mentioned being so high is crazy. I thought that he would have a really hard time backing up his rookie year. He was arguably even better. Like I thought that the rookie year numbers were like a ceiling outcome for year 2, that you would actually probably want to expect him to come down, even though I know that's counterintuitive, but basically my point was he hit such a ceiling that it's hard for a guy to then grow from a huge number. He kind of still did. I mean, he had the highest weighted targets per route in the entire NFL by, my numbers, which is targets per route, adding in some air yards. His targets per route were also the highest by a lot. His yards per route run 3.56. I mean, small sample, but still absurd. His 2 playoff games, like he wasn't at the 37% targets per route, but he was at 29.2. I mean, he's still meaningfully dominant. His missed tackle forced and like yards after contact stuff was improved. He got like more comfortable making plays with the ball in his hand, I think. They gave Kupp just 10 catches across the final 5 games. I mean, I think they really said, we love Puka Nacua. And then, yeah, they went out and got Adams. But one of the things on Adams, he had his lowest targets per route since 2018 last year, meaningfully lower than all the interim years. Still very good at 25.9%. But that was in a year where he was playing with Rodgers for a lot of it and obviously was getting some extra targets because of that. And after the target efficiency was very weak too. He's had a couple years in a row now where the yards per target has been down. And that includes the fact that he did have a couple spike long touchdowns with the Jets late, including like one on a drag route where he was just completely uncovered and he had like a 50-something yard catch and run. He had a long I think it was in that Jaguars game where he also had the long TD up the slot and had the massive ceiling in that week. But it was like all in the second half and a kind of a frantic game that I'm not saying it didn't happen. It did happen. He's a very talented player. But even with those plays, his yards per target was lower than some of his peak stuff from 2 to 3 years ago. And so I think that's at least relevant when you're talking about what he is now and the fact that he's a little bit older. I don't think he's a 30% target per out run guy anymore. I do think he's the secondary guy to Nacua. At the same time, like Matthew Stafford has been great for every receiver that's ever played with him. A guy like Adams, who's always been talked about as a great route runner, should be able to get open. And I think he's meaningful in this passing game too, and especially if Nakua's out at all. I think you get this contingent upside that's like, well, I mean, his numbers weren't so bad last year that I wouldn't bet on him being able to be a top 10 wide receiver in those contingent scenarios. So, I mean, the volume of this pass game can be so concentrated and, you know, from like McVay's tendencies. And then also Stafford as a quarterback is just so good for his top wide receivers that it can just be, it's just, I have a hard time with Adams, but I'm not letting Adams keep me off of Nacua, to answer your initial question.
Yeah. And I'm same page with Adams, and we kind of covered this in the JSN versus Adams versus Marvin Harrison, but probably fine where he goes. Like when you need a receiver, I mean, not someone I'm thrilled about in the middle of the third round, but there's really no one I'm thrilled about. So I think he's okay. And the contingent point is an important point because that's not true for every wide receiver that they'd step in and become, you know, a top 10 guy. It's not true for many of the receivers in round 3. You know, Marvin Harrison and JSN are already their team's wide receiver ones. I guess Harrison, you could say, is behind McBride, but as far as positionally goes, another team with like very weak wide receivers 3 through 5, Tutu Atwell, Jordan Whittington are the most relevant of the two. And just to go through the targets real quick, Tutu Gretch has at 55 targets, Whittington at 50. We're at 48 and 40, pretty similar. Puka Gretch at 152. We're at 140. So very high target numbers from both of us. Devontae Gretch is at 128. We're at 124. I think Tutu is the guy I've been taking late in best ball on stacks as like, hey, this guy is most likely to win the wide receiver 3 job. And like being on the field, you could have some spike weeks. I know Whittington last year was sort of the upside guy. Do you have any hope for a Whittington breakout?
I mean, I guess a little bit. You know, 117 route sample. He did have a 23.9% targets per route, 2.5 yards per route. And Tutu Atwell's numbers were very similar, actually. But I guess I think Atwell's probably still going to be route limited. They're talking about him running more routes this year, but just from a size perspective, Whittington to me, obviously a little bit bigger and maybe a little bit better fit for like, I guess I think of him as like the Nacua handcuff in some ways, but obviously we talked about Adams being the guy that would get a lot of volume in a Nacua. It would make Whittington interesting, but not a star or anything in my mind. But I guess I think the routes volume could get there for Whittington in a way that I'm more skeptical could for Atwell.
Let's finish up with tight end. You've got the vet here in Tyler Higbee versus a rookie in Terrence Ferguson. We've got a little bit of a tighter gap with Higbee at 54 targets and Ferguson at 40. Gretch is at 67 and 29. So similar total pie going to the tight end position. I can't say I have a strong read on that. It looks like, just gauging by your reaction, that you don't have too much of a strong read either. Again, this is primarily a best ball tight end 3 late conversation.
Yeah, the thing with Higbee is he, you know, what was not a meaningful player in 2023 before his ACL, 109 yards per route on 475 routes, 14.1% targets per route. Those are not great. And last year he comes back, and on 86 total routes into the postseason, he has a 29.1% targets per route, 2.07 yards per route. Like, he had a good stretch run last year. I mean, he also had that huge outlier run in 2019 that did not stick the following year. And they went out and addressed with Devontae Adams, and they drafted Terrence Ferguson. I think probably why I'm higher than you guys on him is I was just looking at how much he did at the end of the season after he came back from his ACL last year. But I mean, I think Terrence Ferguson is a really interesting prospect. And my other note on him is that I think they've talked about playing more 12, more 2 tight end sets, more 12 personnel for years, and they don't really actually ever do it. They stay in their heavy 11 personnel. I'm a little curious if drafting Ferguson with Higbee back is going to lead to that more, where it's just Adams and Nacua, and you don't even get like Tutu Atwell or Whittington on the field at all. But Les Snead, the GM, referred to Ferguson directly as the heir apparent to Higbee this offseason. I don't know what that really means, but I guess I took it kind of like how I took the Elijah Arroyo thing, where we know that a lot of times rookie tight ends, they need a little bit of seasoning. And it seems like a couple of the teams in this division, they drafted a tight end to eventually take over the position, but maybe not have a huge fantasy relevant role in year one. But I do really like the Ferguson profile more than I like the Arroyo profile. I want to be in on him. I was drafting more of him in Dynasty. So he's at least somebody to watch on the waiver wire.
Yeah, and just a final note on the 3 wide receiver stuff. They did slightly scale that back last year. They were 81% 3 wide receiver sets after being like virtually all 3 wide receiver sets. It's still, a high number, but some signal that maybe they're perhaps actually starting to trend towards that. And I know McVay made comments about just wanting to be a little bit more diverse in their personnel usage. All right, that'll do it for us on the NFC West edition of the offseason projection special with myself and Ben Gretch. Make sure to check out all of Ben's work at bengretch.substack.com. You can find my stuff and my contributions to our rankings over at Establish the Run. Appreciate everybody tuning in. Have a great week.